August 12, 1942, English Channel, south coast of Britain. The morning haze still clung to the water when the first radar plots appeared on British scopes. Ground controllers at RAF Kenley saw the unmistakable signature. A tight formation of Focke-Wulf 190s skimming low across the channel, using the rising sun to blind the observers on the cliffs. It was a tactic the Luftwaffe had perfected after 1941, fast, shallow-angle approach, a sudden pop-up near the coast, and precision strikes on radar sites, airfields, and coastal defenses before British fighters could respond. For 2 years, these daylight tip-and-run raids had humiliated RAF defenses. The Spitfire Mark V, Britain's primary frontline interceptor, simply couldn't catch the German attackers once they disengaged and dived for home. Along the channel's edge, local fishermen paused their morning routines, hearing what they had come to recognize as the sharp crack of 20mm cannon bursts. The FW-190s were already punching through the thin cloud layer, angling toward the radar masts near Dover, the same ones they had hit twice that month. But something different happened this time. Instead of the familiar silhouette of a Spitfire climbing in vain behind them, the German pilots saw a broad-winged, muscular fighter rising from the south. It closed the gap so quickly that several Luftwaffe leaders later said they initially believed it was a new American machine. It was the Hawker Typhoon, a fighter that until recently had been dismissed as a troubled experiment plagued with structural defects and engine failures. Yet in the blistering, low-altitude environment where the FW-190s felt untouchable, the Typhoon possessed something no British fighter had matched before: sheer, overwhelming speed below 10,000 feet. Its massive Napier Sabre engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, allowed it to accelerate with a ferocity that stunned pilots used to the Spitfire's gentler climb. On that August morning, as the German formation attempted to turn back toward France, they suddenly found the Typhoon not just keeping pace, but overtaking them. The era of consequence-free daylight raids was about to end, and the Luftwaffe would soon learn that Britain had unleashed a fighter designed specifically for this low-altitude knife fight. The Typhoon's sudden battlefield relevance did not happen by accident. It was born out of engineering desperation, operational necessity, and growing pressure to counter the FW-190's dominance. And that story stretched back to a very different morning in 1940, when Britain first realized its next fighter needed to be something entirely new. 2 years before the Typhoon ever intercepted a German fighter, Britain faced a crisis that few outside the Air Ministry truly understood. The Battle of France was collapsing, German armored divisions were slicing toward the Channel, and the RAF suddenly realized that the war would not be won, or even survived, with the aircraft it currently fielded. On that morning in May, Sidney Cam, Hawker's chief designer, stood beside the skeletal frame of an airframe unlike anything his company had built before. It was heavier, broader, and demanded an engine of unprecedented power. Cam understood perfectly well that aviation was shifting into a new era, one defined not by elegant climb rates at altitude but by raw acceleration and brutal speed in the thick, low-altitude air where most real combat was now unfolding. The Air Ministry's specification F.18/37 had already made the stakes clear. Britain needed a fighter capable of more than 400 miles per hour, armed with 4 20mm cannons rather than rifle-caliber machine guns, and able to dive and accelerate fast enough to counter whatever Germany unveiled next. The Hurricane, though reliable, was rapidly reaching its design limits. Even the Spitfire would soon encounter operational ceilings that German engineering might exploit. Thus began the Typhoon's design, a machine intended to preempt threats that did not yet exist. Yet the Typhoon's early life was defined not by triumph but by terrifying setbacks. When the first prototypes took to the air in early 1940, test pilots reported alarming vibrations and unexpected compressibility effects at high speeds. Structural failures in the rear fuselage caused several catastrophic accidents. More worrisome still was the new Napier Sabre engine, an ambitious 24-cylinder power plant that could deliver immense horsepower but often refused to start, overheated under basic stress tests, or backfired with explosive force. Ground crews described early Sabre servicing as a battle, not maintenance. Such problems might have doomed a lesser project. But the Luftwaffe's introduction of the Focke-Wulf 190 in 1941 changed everything. Reports from frontline RAF pilots were blunt. The Spitfire Mark V, for all its elegance, was outclassed at low and medium altitudes. German raids intensified. British coastal towns endured repeated, swift, almost taunting daylight strikes. And as German hit-and-run tactics refined into a daily rhythm, Britain confronted an uncomfortable truth. The only fighter with the raw performance to counter these raids was the troubled, problematic, but astonishingly fast Typhoon. It was this moment of crisis that forced the RAF to gamble on a machine still riddled with flaws, and that gamble would soon reshape the air war over the Channel. By the winter of 1941, the Typhoon had reached frontline squadrons, but confidence in it was fragile. Pilots respected its immense power yet distrusted its temperament. Engine failures on takeoff were still common, carbon monoxide leaks into the cockpit led to emergency landings, and several aircraft broke apart in flight because of tail structure weaknesses that engineers were still struggling to diagnose. Some commanders privately questioned whether the Typhoon belonged anywhere near operational service. But the Luftwaffe answered that debate on Britain's behalf. The Focke-Wulf 190, newly arrived on the Channel front, began to carve out a reputation that deeply alarmed RAF leadership. Climbed faster, dived harder, and out-accelerated anything Britain could scramble. In the spring of 1942, Luftwaffe fighter-bomber units began launching swift, low-level Jabo raids against coastal towns like Hastings, Eastbourne, and Torquay. These strikes lasted minutes, too fast for most British fighters to react. Even when Spitfires managed to intercept, the FW-190s simply broke away in a shallow dive and vanished across the water. British civilians, who had endured the Blitz with resilience, now watched helplessly as daylight attacks returned in a new, more surgical form. Railway stations, radar masts, gasworks, and seafront promenades were hit with unnerving regularity. Ground observers noted that German pilots flew with a confidence bordering on contempt. They believed they could not be caught, and for a time they were right. It was in this environment of frustration and urgency that the Typhoon's reputation finally began to shift. Despite its faults, no British fighter matched its low-altitude speed. While the Spitfire excelled above 20,000 feet, the Typhoon was built for the dense air beneath 10,000 feet, the exact arena where the FW-190 dominated. RAF controllers noticed that whenever a Typhoon joined an interception attempt, the odds of the Germans escaping cleanly dropped sharply. Pilots who had once viewed the aircraft with suspicion now discovered that in a pursuit, the Typhoon simply refused to let go. Engineers, too, made rapid progress. Reinforced tail sections were introduced, cockpit sealing improved, and saber reliability, while still imperfect, grew steadily. The RAF could now field squadrons that combined raw speed, heavy armament, and accelerating pilot confidence. For the first time since the FW-190 appeared, Britain had a credible answer, and the Luftwaffe was about to encounter it. As spring turned to summer, German commanders prepared for another season of daylight harassment raids along Britain's vulnerable coast. What they did not realize was that the RAF had finally positioned a fighter fast enough to break the cycle. When the Luftwaffe renewed its daylight strikes in mid-1942, the pattern was familiar. Small groups of FW-190 fighter bombers sweeping in at wave-top height, releasing bombs with practiced precision, then escaping before British fighters could intervene. This morning's target was the radar chain along the south coast, installations whose brief disruptions could blind fighter command for crucial minutes. The Germans expected another routine mission. What they encountered instead marked a turning point in Britain's defensive air war. Controllers at RAF Tangmere scrambled Typhoons the moment radar plots indicated the Germans' low-altitude approach path. Unlike earlier months, the response was immediate. The Typhoon's ferocious acceleration meant the interceptors were already approaching full speed before the German formation crossed the coast. For the first time, RAF pilots were not chasing contrails or distant specks but moving nose-to-tail with aircraft they could genuinely catch. As the FW-190s completed their attack run and pulled into a shallow climbing turn toward France, the Typhoons closed the distance with startling speed. Pilots later described the moment as a reversal of roles. Instead of watching German fighters pull away in frustrating dives, they now found themselves overtaking them. The Typhoon's superior low-altitude performance, rooted in the Sabre engine's immense power and the airframe's aerodynamic design, allowed it to gain on the fleeing Germans even as both formations pushed close to their maximum speeds. The first engagements were decisive. Several Typhoon pilots recorded confirmed hits, and German intelligence officers soon noted a sharp rise in aircraft damaged or lost during return flights. Luftwaffe reports revealed genuine surprise at the Typhoon's capability, with one squadron leader remarking that a new, extremely fast British fighter had appeared without warning. Operational commanders recognized that the RAF had deployed a machine specifically tailored to the profile of these low-level raids. Even more significant was the psychological shift. Typhoon squadrons, once overshadowed by the Spitfire, now found themselves holding the key to reversing months of German tactical superiority. The aircraft's ability to intercept and engage FW-190s before they escaped across the channel undermined the very foundation of the Luftwaffe's hit-and-run strategy. And as the summer progressed, the Typhoon's growing presence began to alter German planning. Pilots who once viewed the channel as a safe, familiar escape corridor now faced a fighter that could run them down in the exact airspace where they felt strongest. By autumn, commanders on both sides understood that the pattern of daylight harassment raids was changing, and the Typhoon would soon force the Luftwaffe into its next, more desperate set of calculations. By the autumn of 1942, the Luftwaffe could no longer ignore the pattern emerging from its daylight operations. Loss reports from JBO units, once negligible, began climbing with troubling consistency. Aircraft that had previously slipped back across the channel unchallenged now returned with cannon strikes along their wings, punctured coolant radiators, and damaged undercarriages from emergency landings on makeshift strips. The culprit, identified repeatedly in pilot debriefs, was the same: the Hawker Typhoon. German analysts were quick to realize that this new threat did not behave like a Spitfire. Instead of attempting to meet the FW-190s head-on or climb into a turning fight, the Typhoon excelled in the chase, the very phase of combat where German pilots had always felt most secure. For the first time since 1941, they faced an RAF fighter that could match their acceleration, exceed their low-altitude speed, and maintain pressure all the way to the French coastline. Even the FW-190's celebrated roll rate and stability in high-speed dives offered limited escape options when the Typhoon remained firmly on its tail. What unsettled German command even more was the Typhoon's armament. The RAF's decision to equip it with 4 Hispano 20mm cannons meant that a single firing pass could inflict catastrophic damage. Unlike rifle-caliber machine guns, these weapons tore through engine blocks, severed control surfaces, and ignited fuel tanks with ease. Gun camera footage from RAF squadrons showed FW-190s breaking apart or trailing thick black smoke mere seconds into the engagement. Although the Typhoon's early mechanical flaws had not disappeared entirely, frontline pilots now spoke of the aircraft with rising confidence. Its stability at high speeds allowed them to fire accurately in the chase, and its rugged airframe absorbed punishment that might cripple lighter fighters. RAF controllers began assigning Typhoons to the most critical interception zones, particularly along the Sussex and Kent coasts, where German tip-and-run attacks had once been most destructive. By late 1942, Luftwaffe JBO units faced a stark operational reality. The narrow escape window across the channel, the foundation of their tactic, was closing rapidly. Losses mounted. Morale dipped. Mission planners reduced the depth of penetration into Britain, shortened attack runs, and ordered pilots to jettison bombs early at the first sign of interception. These defensive adjustments weakened the tactical effect of raids and signaled a clear shift. The Luftwaffe was losing the freedom of daylight action it had enjoyed since 1941. But the real breaking point came when the Typhoon's growing effectiveness intersected with a broader deterioration of German air power along the Western Front. That convergence, emerging in early 1943, would finally collapse the daylight raid strategy altogether. By early 1943, the strategic balance over the channel had shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe's JBO units, once confident in their ability to strike and escape at will, now faced a defender uniquely engineered for their altitude, speed, and escape profile. Every month, Typhoon interceptions grew more frequent, more coordinated, and more lethal. Losses forced German commanders to curtail daylight operations, restrict deep penetrations, and eventually abandon routine harassment missions altogether. Even when raids were attempted, they were shorter, less accurate, and carried out with a caution that reflected the new danger waiting over the coast. British coastal towns that had braced for near-daily attacks began experiencing long stretches of uninterrupted calm. Fighter Command's intelligence summaries from spring 1943 made the trend unmistakable. The Luftwaffe's daylight tip-and-run raids had effectively ceased. And while the Typhoon would later earn fame as a ground attack aircraft in Normandy, its first and perhaps most immediate contribution to the war was ending a campaign of strikes that had plagued Britain for 2 years. The fighter once doubted for its flaws had closed the Channel, reclaimed Britain's daylight skies, and forced the Luftwaffe to concede an entire phase of the air war.